Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon for some and good morning for others, because we've got a large part of the globe represented here today. Delighted to welcome you to this launch of the book, edited by Judith Anderson, Therese Thornton, Caroline Hickman, and Jenny O'Gorman, called Being a Therapist in Time of Climate Breakdown, which has brought together a whole range of contributors, largely from the Climate Psychology Alliance, but some from beyond it, to really examine in detail and with a whole range of different voices and insights what it means to be a psychotherapist during this time of climate breakdown. As many of you who've already started to look at the book will know, the book comprises a number of different sections according to different themes, but it also brings together a variety of different voices from people who are often excluded or don't find themselves included in publications such as this. So in the course of the gathering this evening, we will not only explore some of the different themes, drawing on contributors to each one, but we'll also have some of those different voices represented in the presentation that is about to take place. Without further ado, I will pass you on to Judith Anderson, who will introduce the first section of the book, the introduction. Thank you, Judith.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And I'm going to say a little bit about how the book began. And this is partly your responsibility, Paul, because about 2 years ago, perhaps just under that time, you had a letter from Routledge inviting a potential publication about climate change and mental health and therapy and climate change. You passed it on to me, and in conversation, we thought it was such a good opportunity. And I think it's important to say that this was quite a democratic process. I put a message out to CPA members asking if anybody would be interested in editing such a book. And a few people stepped forward, and then it emerged that some people didn't have the time and energy because they were involved in other things. But we also put out a call to members of CPA. And it was only after we had those responses that we then did some invitations to other people to really complete the puzzle, in a sense, complete a picture of all the different facets that we could think of that seemed really important. And I'm going to ask Tree now to say something about the professional context in which we did this work.
Yeah, thanks, Judith. I think that the invitation from Routledge came at a really good time for us in terms of our capacity and time, those of us who were editing, and obviously not a moment too soon in terms of the climate. So I want to thank Grace McDonald from Routledge, if she's here, who was proactive. And the responses from colleagues who've contributed chapters was heartening, and so many different aspects were covered. And I think the book's come together really well. And we hope that its message will spread and help therapists to know there are resources available and there will be training and CPD. So what I and some of my colleagues have been focusing on is training and education. As a director of a counselling and psychotherapy training, I've been focusing on training up future therapists to equip them to deal with what's happening, to deal with their own responses to the climate crisis as a prerequisite to being able to receive and respond to clients. And I've also been involved with regulation within the UK Council for Psychotherapy to set the standards for training and education so that all future therapists will be climate aware. This project to get agreement on the environmental additions to the training standards took 5 or 6 years. And it wasn't without resistance from some colleagues, although I will say in the humanistic and integrative section of UKCP, there was broad support. So this is an important piece of work, and I want to acknowledge my colleague Sue Milner, who is here and has co-authored a chapter in the book. So I do want to mention our beloved earth lawyer, Polly Higgins, who used to say, the earth is in trouble and needs a good lawyer. And I think we can say similarly, the earth is in pain and needs a good many therapists. I wanted to quote Wilfred Bion, who famously said that in every consulting room, there ought to be two rather frightened people. And this is never more true than for therapists dealing with climate distress and anxiety and grief. But if not us, then who? So, Judith, I'd like to pass back to you to outline the sections.
Yes, I'm going to do that very briefly, but I also want to say first that absolutely in agreement with what Trees said about therapy, but this book also challenges the individualism of therapy. And I think that's really important to say. So we've set out the book in 5 different sections. They do overlap. And the first is the trouble we're in, and that's setting out, as it were, the scientific case, the ethical case, and a climate psychology case for the book. And then we deliberately went straight into the need for systemic understandings and different systemic understandings. And there are 3 of them. And so we're really, and they're very different, and yet they have overlapping themes. And we hope that really is nourishing for therapists to be able to engage with a systemic understanding. And then there's a very important section on climate therapy and what it means to be a climate aware therapist, and to really segue between the personal and the systemic as far as climate's concerned. There's then a section on the ecological self. And then we move into a section with so many varied different contributions of methodologies that aren't therapy, but require the kind of therapeutic skills of listening and holding, but really take thinking about climate change emotions into the outside world, social and community approaches. So I'm going to ask Jenny about her vision for the book, and then Jenny's going to pass to Caroline.
I am, that's right. Thank you, Judith. I want to say a little bit about the context for me in which the book sits. So for me, this book is published at a time when global heat record has just been broken for the 10th consecutive month, a time when the erosion of social structures leaves many feeling isolated and overwhelmed, a time when denial and disinformation are so pervasive that it can seem as though every fact is now up for debate, which can be infuriating on a personal level, but also difficult on a professional level when you're in the room with somebody who maybe has taken in a lot of that disinformation. And how do you sit with that? Amidst all of this, therapists and clients alike are grappling with the many changes, internal and external, which are forced upon us. Climate breakdown is, of course, a multifaceted process. There's planetary and interpersonal boundaries both approaching or exceeding tipping points, and that leaves all of us in various states of collapse, whatever that looks like. This has left many of us seeking direction. How do we think about our work in this context, so different from the expectations we had when training, as Tria's alluded to? And how do we situate ourselves so that the client's material remains at the forefront, but so that we're not colluding and denying reality? How do we relate to ourselves and each other when the known world is in flux? So for me, all of those questions and more have been thought about, if not answered. Can they be answered in the writing of this book and in the editing of this book? It's been a great privilege for me to be involved in co-editing this. I feel like it's a much needed book. It's been a collective endeavour with contributions which extend far beyond the established frame of who usually gets to speak about therapy. And that's been something that's been really meaningful for me. My personal hope is that this book will prompt readers to inhabit the liminal space of being and not being, to see what other possibilities exist in the world. I think that the book itself sits within a rich tapestry of other works of relationality and curiosity. And it's in that spirit that I invite people to reflect critically on what underpins our current modes of practice, what other possibilities might exist if we move beyond the status quo, to relate compassionately to the full plurality of our present times. That's for me, the underpinning theme throughout all of the chapters and sections of this book. And I hope that you'll agree when you read it that those come together. And I will pass over to Caroline from there.
Thanks, Jenny and Tree and Judith. I mean, Tree and Judith have worked for years to try and get professions to take this seriously in the psychotherapy profession. And I don't know if everybody's aware, I'm sure many of you are aware, but today, Dr. Sarah Ben, a GP and NHS doctor of 30 years, has been found guilty of professional misconduct by a General Medical Council hearing. She's going to be the first of many professions who are found guilty of speaking out, protesting, taking part in activism against the climate crisis. Paul, you and I had a conversation last year and you asked me, you said, you know, do I see psychology and psychotherapy as a form of activism nowadays? And we discussed it. And I said, yeah, how can it not be when we're framing it in this way? And Tree, at the UKCP conference, you took up that argument about, you know, are psychotherapists going to get struck off and prevented from working and lose their license if they speak out? We didn't get an answer, but you took it up. I feel quite emotional. I think it's really important. And this book may be speaking out in a particular way. But crucially, and we're going to talk about it a bit more in a minute, but crucially, we've got the voice of activists in this book alongside the voice of therapists, alongside the voice of young people. And in many ways, I wish we didn't need therapy that paid attention to the climate crisis. It's a bit of a bizarre dilemma, isn't it? Given that, you know, it's a mentally healthy response to be distressed. So we don't really want people to need therapy around the climate crisis. The people who are failing to act on the climate crisis might be the ones who need the therapy. But meanwhile, we're trying to navigate these really difficult places without pathologizing and labeling, but bringing professional concern into this. And I think that's what I can see this book doing. When I was training, it was spooky, and I don't know if it's the same for other people, but whatever I felt we were dealing with in the training room, my clients would start turning up with the same issues that week or the following week. You know, we were talking about borderline states. I'd have a load of people turn up with borderline states. And I didn't know if that was me seeing it or if they were turning up with it. In the collective, in the archetypal, maybe getting this book out there is also kind of putting a message into the collective unconscious, the archetypal, just by fact that it's there, sort of calling on the lost words argument that we need therapy to not lose its voice around this. So let's hope that this book does contribute to that. If that's it. And I just wanted to raise the issue of Sarah, because it's important for us therapists too, professionals. Thank you. Back to you, Judith.
Well, it's back to Paul, actually.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. And just a quick word about one other CPA member, Trudy Warner, who is in the High Court today. Many of you will know that they have reserved their judgment until Monday, so Trudy won't know whether she's going to be taken to full trial or not until Monday. But I think it's another sign of this creeping criminalization of protest, which is now affecting both the medical profession and increasingly, I think it will be affecting our own therapeutic professions as well. So, Caroline, I'm going to take it back to you again because you're going to introduce the next section, which is to introduce some of the voices that we will find in this book. So, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to be so super quick now. So it's my enormous pleasure to welcome 4 representatives of the voices that we see throughout the book. We've got Will, Eloise, Eva, and Chloe, who've joined us tonight as representatives. We just felt it was really important in the book that we wanted the voice of therapy from many, many different perspectives. The one thing I don't think we've quite managed to do is the voice of the earth. So I was kind of imagining and fantasizing about sort of just turning up and making animal noises, but I'm not going to because it's way too embarrassing. So, Will, where are you? There you are. Will.
Hi, Caroline. Thank you so
Hi.
much.
Will,
Thank you.
thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand over to you. And Will, if everybody's not heard, Will is the photographer who took the photograph, which we are delighted to have on the front of the book. So thank you, Will. Over to you.
So thank you, Caroline, and thank you to everyone else who contributed with this book. Children need help with their climate anxiety. So hello, everyone. I'm so pleased you like my photo. This photo means a lot to me, not just because it took me a month to get, but because I really want to capture the beauty of these special birds. Behind my house, there's a meadow with a river going through it, with a variety of different animals, from fox to deer to woodpeckers and kingfishers. There are also 3 amazing barn owls. Trying to capture, so I went into the field over 30 times, taking hundreds of shots, trying to capture the barn owls in their natural habitat without disturbing their natural behaviour. I think this photo really captures the intelligence and uniqueness of these remarkable birds. Did you know that barn owls can fly completely silent, but sadly their numbers are dropping due to pollution and loss of habitat? For me, wildlife photography shows people the beauty of the natural world. That's one of the reasons why I started wildlife photography and hope to continue it as a career as a wildlife photographer and documentary maker. Wildlife photography has helped me with my own climate anxiety, making me feel that if I can capture the beauty and wonder of the natural world, it will show other people what we must save. Thank you.
That's beautifully put, Will. You told me you were going to wear your I Love David Attenborough t-shirt, but I don't think you did.
No, I didn't, no.
We love him too, and we love your photograph. And what you've just said there is really beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand over to Eloise.
Hello, so I'm also got a bit of a nature background. I'm an ecologist by training, and my voice added another owl. I was helping my friends research also on barn owls, so there's a bit of a theme going through the book now. But I was going to say thank you for including and creating space to include voices. I suppose I'm coming here today as an ecologist by training, but also as a youth activist who's been doing climate activism in a more formal sense for the past 5, nearly 6 years now. I greatly appreciate taking up the space within this book. There's so much knowledge within this book, so much expertise. But I also agree that I think it's very important to have the voice of those who are maybe also going to be most impacted by the climate crisis itself, just to keep the sense of urgency that you often find in the youth movement also within the book as well. I don't remember a time when the planet hasn't been in crisis. I think from the age of 4 or 5, I learned reduce, reuse, cycle, energy-efficient light bulbs, the polar bears are dying, the ice caps are melting. And growing up, I've just seen it get worse with my own eyes and struggle with the contradiction between what I was experiencing to what I was learning, either from my parents, from school, from uni, the mixed match between I remember experiencing this reality changing from when it used to snow when I walked to school to rarely ever snowing at all now. I'm from Canterbury, and it being 40-degree summers. And as I understood, and as it got worse, my own eco-anxiety getting worse, and being very lost as to what to do with it, often either having to try and figure out how to do it alone, or it got better when I found another group of climate activists who we also don't know what to do with it. But at least we had each other, and that made it significantly better and easier to just form a community. But the one time I mentioned it was in a counselling session for completely unrelated issues, it was met with confusion, and I felt the need to minimise it, that it wasn't a relevant issue on top of the others I brought into the session. And this counsellor was lovely, like she was great and helped me so much. But for all the other topics I brought up, this is one I couldn't. And I didn't try again after the first time because I didn't want there to be another place where this intensity of feeling and often conflicting, very confusing feelings would be rejected again from my day-to-day. And from other places I searched for it. And I'm part of a group called the UK Youth Climate Coalition, and one of the working groups is the community working group, which I'm in. And it focuses a lot on trying to get the average person to recognise how much power and influence they have within the climate movement. And that's whatever background that you have, because the climate is such an all-encompassing issue, there is a role that you can play. In this case, I hope that it's people's professions and education, understanding, expertise can be adjusted and brought into the climate crisis. But even for those who aren't therapists, psychologists, psychotherapists, all of the above, that there are also just to recognise that you have your own little power and your own circle of influence. Maybe you're good at organising, maybe you're good at rallying, maybe you're good at just providing comfort. And all these skills are so important as you move into the climate, as it's going to get worse. As much as all the activists are fighting, we still need to have these support networks in order for us to develop as a community, to create a space for care and to make it less painful overall. So I hope that is clear in my voice section within the book, and that some of you can take that away with you and consider your own sort of bounds of influence and what you can do for the planet.
Thanks so much, Eloise. Eva, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Caroline. It's a total honour to be involved in this amazing book in a small way. I'm Eva and I live down in Devon. I'm a mother with 2 children whose future I worry about constantly. I'm a regenerative grower doing a small bit to help the food system transition locally. And I'm also part of the movement returning beavers to Britain, because for me that is about resilience for future generations. Speaks to Eloise's aims a little, I think. I've actually tried a few different climate activism routes over the last decade, but standing in a beaver wetland 4 years ago was the first time I felt hope for our futures and for the landscape. So that drives me to sort of feel it's a useful place to be. And beavers are something that sit in the web of various aspects of my life, like education, food, and conservation. They're beautiful native creatures to this country, beavers, and they have a very exciting impact on our landscapes, from flood and drought mitigation to water quality improvement to biodiversity booms and even mental health uplifts for people. And the reason I give my time to beavers and to growing is climate activism. They have just as much right to be here as we do, and their effect on the land is a very healing one, which is something that we can all learn from and heal ourselves alongside. Regenerative futures start with the individual, which I think takes a serious dose of self-awareness and authenticity. My therapeutic journey has been about personal growth, relationship escape, how to live and how to be in a time of climate crisis, and stick to my principles and therefore help my children and help their future. And it's a massive challenge to do that without support. The thread of climate crisis weaves through all my time and energy, and I really believe it's the lens through which everyone should be making decisions now, whether that's personal decisions in relationships or professional or parenting. So having a climate aware therapist was absolutely instrumental to my fairly fractious healing journey over the last 3 years or so. And it felt very strange to write a beavery bit for this climate therapy book, but I think hopefully it'll add a little something to everyone's journey in it.
Thank you, Eva. I love your beavery bit. It's awesome. So we've got owls, beavers, and Chloe, over to you.
Thank you, Caroline. Hi, everybody. Like Eva, I'm a parent, and I've been an activist since the day that I considered what it might mean for me as a parent if I couldn't feed my children or if I couldn't keep them safe, what decisions that might force me to make. I hope it's enough in this company to say that's my downfall scenario. But we see parents making awful decisions every day right now. This is real world stuff. That vision for me was absolutely paralyzing. I spent about 6 months in a state of trauma. But as many of us know, climate action is good for your mental health, and that's absolutely been my experience. Once I began taking action, I realized that I could just about run faster than my fear and run faster than that awful vision I'd had of having to make terrible choices for my children. But being set on a path of activism is not the end of the problem. Activism, as Eva's just said, is a lens over my entire life. It affects every single relationship, personal, professional, romantic, every family relationship, including that with my parents, my sister, and my children. And the most difficult thing to hold is my anger. I'm absolutely fucking furious all the time. And we're not socially comfortable with anger, and particularly the anger of women. So I struggle to express that a lot of the time. But I'm angry with politicians and policymakers, and I'm angry with every single individual who is not responding to this crisis with the urgency it demands. I'm a really tough dinner guest these days. But channeling and focusing that anger has enabled extraordinary personal growth for me over the last few years and enabled me to do things that I never thought I could do. But I owe my sanity and my stability to the therapist who has understood how to hold and support that. And I'm so grateful that this book exists to empower and inform more professionals to do this essential work for others, because there are going to be more of us feeling this way indefinitely until we make things better. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe, so much. You've all spoken from your hearts, and we deeply appreciate your contribution to the book and being here and speaking with us tonight. I'm going to hand over in 1 second, but I'm just going to encourage people, when you look at the book, if you haven't Googled T-Rex versus TMX yet, do, because you will get to see Emily wearing her T-Rex costume, climbing over fences as a climate activist with a very hilarious musical soundtrack. And we need to be able to laugh about these painful things too. So if you have not looked at Emily's films on YouTube, I highly recommend it. Okay, over to you, Judith, I think.
Yeah, Judith,
Paul.
we're now going to move on to this section 1 of the book, which is the trouble we're in, which lays out the tasks, in a sense, that now face us, both from a scientific and from a climate psychological perspective. Judith, you're going to talk, and Peter Kalmus, I think we've got here with us, and Jenny O'Gorman is going to speak again as well. So Judith, do you want to take us away?
Yes, thank you. We were really pleased to have a climate scientist help us set this initial chapter, initial section really lays out, this is the trouble we're in. This is what climate psychology is about. This is how climate change affects our mental health, not just in terms of anxiety and grief, but also climate trauma, and also the impacts of temperature on mental health, which of course is in the wider context of deaths from high temperature. You know, it's very difficult for me to understand how people think that we and the whole climate community is exaggerating when you read what is happening in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And then Jenny's chapter is really important because it lays the ethical frame for that. So I hope, Trang, are you able to pin Peter and myself and Jenny? Because if not, I'll do that.
I have done so, and it appears you four on my screen. So
okay, that's great. And so if you can unpin the other people as well, and then it's clearer to see. That's great. So Peter, thank you very much for being with us from, I think you're on the East Coast of the States. Are you able to just say a few words, because you're also an activist scientist, and you've not been afraid of campaigning through your scientific knowledge.
Yeah, how's my audio sound? Okay.
Yes, it's good.
Okay, yeah, well, I don't really know what to say, especially just in a couple of minutes. I think the main thing that I feel is that I'm really glad to be part of this growing group. You know, I'm really looking forward to reading the book and hearing all of the wisdom and maybe starting to get to know some of you. I think I started being a climate activist in 2006, and then I became a climate scientist in 2012. I thought when I became a climate scientist that I would feel less alone in my kind of climate emotions, and that was not the case. I think it made it worse because I couldn't really understand how the other scientists weren't freaking out the way I am constantly. I haven't done a ton of therapy in my life, but about a year ago, I started doing both individual and couples therapy. It's made a huge difference. I've had a kind of mismatch in my with my partner, my life partner, in terms of sort of intensity of climate emotion, and that's been challenging over the almost 20 years that I've been basically thinking about this nonstop. And yeah, I don't know how other climate scientists avoid doing civil disobedience, and I'm starting to think that the movement has to escalate to other tactics that are even maybe higher levels of radicalness, because there's a new study that came out getting a lot of airtime and a lot of articles being written about it, I think today in Nature, about how after 2050, every year with climate change will cost at least $38 trillion more than if we didn't have climate change. And my first reaction to that was, first, I've said over and over again that we're literally at risk of losing everything. And I don't think that people fully understand how kind of literally I mean that. I think when you say you're going to lose $38 trillion a year, that's kind of capitalism's way of saying you're going to lose literally everything. And I don't understand. Like, I think it's so, it makes me very, I don't know what the word is, but it's quite telling, I think, that the system's only way of understanding that we'll lose everything is to frame it in a dollar amount like that, because obviously the capitalist sort of death cult system that we're all trapped in is what's causing this. So we're like fish, and the water that we're swimming in is the problem. And that's why I think I'm not sure how therapists are going to deal with that, but and I guess I would say it's been really useful that I've had great therapists who in my opinion are climate aware. 10 years ago, I was in therapy and we couldn't find a good therapist. And I think part of it was because I would talk about climate stuff and they just didn't get it at all. And that just made me feel super gaslit. Like, there's no possible way I could have a useful relationship with a therapist who didn't understand the climate crisis at the same level of urgency that I do, right? It's just not, it's not going to work at all.
Okay.
Yeah. Is that it? That's all the time.
I think so. And thank you, Peter. And thank you also for laying out the science, as well as being in touch with the raw feelings. And
yeah, I wish I could have done a better job with the science, but hopefully it's helpful.
Yeah. Jenny, can you talk about the importance of ethics that you've written about? Because you really see this issue as a big challenge to ethical thinking.
Yeah, of course. And I've written about the need for a new perspective on ethics in particular in the book, because I think we need a way of working and being which takes into account how environmental breakdown necessitates an alternative view of what's appropriate in our practice. I think it's vital that we explore the implications of these changing times, as well as the possibility afforded to us to engage with different ways of being in the world and in therapy. So in my chapter, I've invited the reader to consider how the therapeutic status quo might be contributing to an individualized and pathologizing mindset that limits the biodiversity of emotion to one in which progress is often framed in neocolonial terms. So by that, I mean the conversion of emotions into medicalized symptoms, some of which are acceptable and others which have to be parceled up and enclosed or exploited. And I'm arguing for an integrated perspective, one where true resilience comes from a meaningful relationship with all of the different parts of oneself. And in the chapter, I've used case examples to try to show what this might look like in practice. And I also use the existing ethical frameworks of multiple accrediting institutions to show some of the many ways that current therapeutic practice could shift to sustain ourselves and our clients. And indeed, I'm suggesting that some shifts are necessary if we're going to consider our practice ethical in the future that's waiting for us. I think the chapter sits well within the broader context of the book, actually, not just this section, where other contributors have written about the ways they're already broadening and deepening their own ways of being a therapist to account for the changing needs of clients, practitioners, and the wider world as a whole. I think increasingly we have to grapple with the fact that many of our institutions, especially in the global north, are rooted in practices and assumptions which don't align with the principles of climate justice. So what assumptions are we making about what's considered illness, for example? Who makes those decisions? Who benefits or suffers as a result? In what other ways might therapy replicate patterns of power which are maintaining an exploitative status quo? What other potentialities are we foreclosing by failing to question the choices we make, consciously and unconsciously, about what to attend to and what we neglect? I think a new ethics means being alive to our privilege of choice and tuning into all of the things that we do not and perhaps cannot know. In a time of climate breakdown, for me, it becomes a moral imperative to resource ourselves and to resource each other. And I hope that this book can be one such resource, and that thinking about ethics in this way can mean that we are finding other ways of resourcing each other rather than just leaning on the old status quo.
Thank you so much.
What I'll say about ethics for now.
No, thank you.
Always lots to say.
Yeah, I think your chapter's really important. And I also want to acknowledge the work of Rebecca Nestor, who helped me write the chapter on climate psychology, because she really draws on all of those theorists, Paul included, Sally Weintraub, Mary Jane Rust, so many people who have written about the psychology of climate change in depth. And she brings that together very eloquently in the part of the chapter that she wrote. And I'm sorry she can't be with us today. So Paul, back to you.
Okay, thank you. We're running behind time slightly, so I'm going to have to be stern on occasion as chair of this discussion. Just one thing you'll notice right at the end, we've got a period which will be for questions and discussion. If you have any questions to put to any of the contributors that you hear today, do put your questions in the chat, and we will try and pick them up and use them later on. The next section I'm going to look to Gareth Morgan to introduce, which is a section on systemic understandings. Gareth.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, we'll try and be quicker because of time. So I'm here with Tree and Iona. So Iona is one of the contributors of this section as well. We agreed I'd do a bit of a rant, and hopefully Tree and Iona can interrupt me and intersect. So I'm not just giving a monologue. The section 2 of the book consists of 4 chapters and 2 voices, one of which we've heard from already from Chloe. I only got the book and managed to read Chloe's bit yesterday and found it incredibly powerful. There's also a voice from Helen Leonard-Williams, who writes of the need for therapists to be aware of the isolating impacts of ableism when making sense of the experience of disabled activists. So section 2 is about systemic approaches. There are various themes that cut across the chapters in this section, not least what Judith mentioned at the beginning about the need to sort of trouble sort of having an individual approach to therapy, and that it's impossible for us to make sense of our individual and collective responses to the climate and ecological emergencies without attending to wider socio-political structures. You know, that the personal is political. We need to recognize how what's going on out there impacts on what's going on in here. So the section opens with a powerful challenge to the mental health industry by the prolific Steffi Bednarek, who can't be here today, but she notes the links between our dominant approaches to therapy and colonial, patriarchal, and capitalist ideologies that have taken us to the brink of extinction. And Steffi's writing from a Gestalt lens, and she's skillfully making the case that therapists need to widen their field of vision to consider wider context, materiality, spirituality, and our interconnectedness with the more than human world. So the next chapter in the book is also one concerned with offering an approach that counters individualistic understandings of distress. And it's a chapter that's based on work I've done with various colleagues, including Garrett Barnwell, who I've seen is here in the room, and there's a chapter in the book as well. So it's about how climate distress might be understood through the lens of the Power Threat Meaning Framework, or PTMF for short, which is a framework that was developed by the British Psychological Society to offer an alternative to diagnostic approaches to distress, which, whilst continuing to dominate how we think about mental health in Western overdeveloped nations, lack evidence and are also deeply linked with neoliberal capitalist ideologies and other discourses that the authors in this section have problematized. So it's a framework I found helpful to make sense of my own reactions to climate breakdown, and it's offered in the chapter as one of many other frameworks that might be of use to therapists, individuals, groups, and communities to make sense of their different reactions. By centering power and thinking about the way that ideology, misinformation, discourse constrains the meanings we can make of our experiences, and how we need to understand how the ways we respond are also affected by the power resources we have available to us. We're all in the same storm, but we're not on the same boat. Iona, your chapter's next in the section. Do you want to say a bit about your chapter, and I can finish off with a bit about Celia and Joe's chapter?
Yeah, thank you. Wow. Gosh. Someone may have to limit me. I might, it's so much, isn't it? And the first bit I want to do is just to greet everybody that's here from all the different places in the world and the earth that you're on and the beings that are around you, and really welcome all of that nature, including our own nature, and gratitude for being here. And I hope that inspiration comes somewhere out of all of this. So this is a very timely book, and it's a time where new patterns of embodied thinking are absolutely needed in the world. We can't do with our old head furniture. It doesn't work anymore. And the patterns are very cross-disciplinary. And so for me, when we're talking about therapy, what links with that is therapy and facilitation, because we are not taught pretty much anywhere how to facilitate ourselves, our communities, our relationships, and our relationship with the world. And there's a whole load of skills that are really needed to facilitate, whether it doesn't even have to be facilitating conflict. Sue and I, and Sue's here, and I can't tell you how grateful I am, Sue, that we did this journey together. It was a real journey of the heart. And we called our chapter World Out There, World in Here, Practicing Systemic Understanding. And there's a bunch of different things that we tease out or break that down into. And that's Arnie Mendel process work talks about systems with awareness, that the world that we inhabit has awareness, and that impacts on how we live in it if we allow it to, and if we have the tools and the awareness to do that. And so when we talk about systemic awareness, we are talking about fields that are populated not only with individuals and people, but also with dreams and with feelings. And those dreams and feelings pattern the field as much, if not more so,
than the actual physical entities that we are. And working with that is potentially very creative, because our dreaming life has the potential to offer us patterns that are needed in finding what is our unique facilitator style. How do we, each of us individually, tackle this, our contribution in the world? And if I can only name one more thing, it would be to say, I would put a big banner saying, please, everybody, study structural discrimination. Please, everybody, study the way in which you may or may not be aware of your own, what we might call rank advantages and disadvantages. They are not only individual and personal, they are structural. And that applies at a global level. And if we don't address that, we will not be earning the trust of many people that I would like to see here. And that's a challenge. It's a really big challenge. We are
I'm going to have to ask you to close down.
Thank you. Read the
Sorry.
chapter.
Okay.
Can I Paul, very briefly speak? Oh, sorry, Tree. I was going to briefly speak to Jo and Celia's chapter.
Just add something, Gareth, because Steffi's not here. And as you've acknowledged, Steffi wrote a chapter that really challenges how therapy reinforces this hyper individualism and that is the capitalist culture. And she also acknowledges how some therapies are moving beyond an anthropocentric individual paradigm. And I think I've had the honor of editing her a couple of times. I think she's a tremendously creative thinker. And so just one of the little gems that she gives in her chapter, where she says, what does the dream ask of you? So when somebody brings a dream, or they're asked, what did you get from your therapy? What Steffi is saying is, how can you be of service to this dream? It's not about what you can get, it's about what you're being asked. And I think, that's just one little gem from her chapter. It's a really important chapter of addressing field theory and how to change our ways of being therapists to bring in the wider system.
Thanks, Tree. And I know we're behind time. I just want to give 2 sentences. I can't do justice to Celia Turley and Jo McAndrew's chapter in a brief bit of time, but just to say it's a really powerful chapter on the theme of motherhood and parenting, with dilemmas that parents face in the time of a climate crisis, and also one that brings in the importance of the outside in. Definitely worth a read.
Good. Thank you, Gareth, Iona, Tree. We are running behind. I was wondering, Trang, Judith, if we might be able to add another 15 minutes to our schedule. So those who wish to, we would carry on until 9 o'clock, because otherwise we're not going to have any time for chatting and discussion at the end. Anyway, let's get on with the next section. Section 3, becoming a climate aware therapist. I'm going to pass my conductor's baton on to Tree, who's going to introduce this section and some of our contributors. Tree.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So this is really where we get into, in the book, the discussion of various therapeutic approaches. And I think it should be, we should really start with you, Panu, because I think you are wanting to go to bed. You're later than us. You're in Finland. Do you want to join us and say something about your chapter? Hi.
Hyvää iltaa. Greetings from Helsinki. The discussion is so exciting that I not go to bed, but I appreciate you giving me the first run. Climate grief can be totally terrible but fundamentally, sadness is a friend who helps us to acknowledge losses and engage with them. This is roughly the start point of my chapter, which engages with theories of grief and bereavements and applies that to climate grief and coping and engaging with them. So there would be much that I would love to say about the chapter, but because time is running, I'll just put one quote to the chat. So this is a key idea: nurturing an attitude which understands the complexities of climate grief, but does not pathologize the phenomenon, even while keeping an eye for clinically significant manifestations of grief, anxiety, and depression. A sadness positive attitude can help to understand how grief and sadness serve life. So there's lots of different terms for losses and grief, but this is the attitude. Very glad and proud to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Panu. And I think one of the terms that you use is disenfranchised grief. And Steffi also refers to that in the previous section. How rarely does our thinking about trauma include catastrophic loss of attachment to place? You know, that's a disenfranchised grief because it's not recognized that we have those attachments to place and obviously to other beings. So it's a very useful term that you use, the disenfranchised grief. So if we go back to who wants to speak next from this section, do you want to say something? Trudy, would you like to go and talk about your research, which was in this section?
Yeah, thank you, Tree. Yeah, I'll try and be brief. I guess the starting point for my research, which I didn't realize at the time, but became apparent as I worked through it, was trying to resolve something in myself, which was the tension that I felt as a therapist and an activist, and holding both of those identities and trying to understand how I can be both. And my chapter builds on the kind of findings that I made through interviewing therapists and clients and activists, and seeing the way in which clients don't bring their feelings generally directly into therapy, but instead they arrive as sort of side mentions that therapists struggle to recognize and receive and know what to do with. And that's because of the play of defenses that are going on between the therapeutic dyad. And I draw attention to some of the social defenses. And you know, I kind of, it's good to hear that Tree, your work with UKCP around guidelines and training and ethical practice. What do we mean by ethical practice now? Because a lot of therapists use that as a way of not engaging with these issues of climate when they come in as side mentions and don't seem to be part of the actual contract of the client's therapy. So I draw attention to that. And what I hope to be able to do with the chapter is really give some suggestions of how we as therapists might begin to change the way we work. First and foremost, being able to do our own work around our feelings about the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, and taking that to a deeper level in terms of our own work for ourselves, being more proactive with our clients, how to hold hope in the therapy around these issues, because there's so much hopelessness and powerlessness associated with those feelings. And then how do we begin to recraft and revision our practice? And so that's kind of building, I guess, on the previous section around taking this systemic view of our work, because I do believe we have an important role to play. So I hope the chapter's useful.
Yeah,
and thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Trudy. And one of the interesting pieces in your research was when you said that those people who you researched with really liked direct questions. They really liked being asked directly about how they felt about the climate emergency. And so one of the other chapters, Caroline, I hope you don't mind if I just mention Paula's chapter, because it connects, that Paula was writing, referring to two different cases, one in which she did try to bring in an interpretation with the client about the climate emergency, or about about flying. And it sort of knocked the therapy relationship a bit, and it was because it was coming in, it wasn't coming from the client, it was coming from the therapist. And in another, where there's a dream where it's very clear to the therapist that there are elements in there about the climate crisis, but she chooses not to mention it because it's the first dream the client has bought, and so on. And I think those sensitivities are always having to be balanced, aren't they? Do we bring something in, or do we not? Is it our agenda coming in? Is there a hint that it's wanted? So I just wanted to say that about Paula. Paula wasn't able to be here, but I think her chapter really gives some good illustrations of case studies. And then we've got Caroline. I hope that you'll be able to speak about your really important chapter in this section about working with children and young people.
Thanks, Tree. I'm not known for keeping things short, but I am going to keep it short, I promise. I've been doing a piece of work with Greenpeace recently, and they conducted a survey for me. It's not published yet, but I'm going to tell you what we're finding. And this is with young children, 6 and 7-year-olds. And 80% of 700 6 and 7-year-olds that we surveyed in the UK are frightened of climate change. We're creating long-term mental health difficulties for our children by not taking action on this. There's nothing else I can say about it. It's now being classed, in my view, as an adverse childhood experience, similar to experiencing terrorism or war. And this has long-term impact on children's mental health. Barack Obama said in 2015, I think it was, our children in the future are going to look back at us and say, did we do all that we could do to deal with the climate crisis? As we've already seen tonight and heard tonight, particularly from Will, children and young people have a close affinity with the natural world, and children and animals are the only innocents, really, in all of this. The rest of us are culpable, not necessarily guilty. We can argue about that later, but we are culpable. And I know we here are doing what we can. In the research that we published in the Lancet Planetary Health in 21, I have to keep repeating this statistic. And I said it today to a lawyer involved in climate litigation. I said, therapists are ignoring children and young people when they talk about this. 48% of children of the 10,000 young people said they were dismissed or ignored when they tried to talk about climate change. And this lawyer said to me, she said, the therapist shouldn't dismiss anything. Why on earth are they dismissing that? And she's absolutely right. If she gets that, then everybody else really needs to get that. So what I tried to present in this chapter was a mixture of some of these statistics, which I endlessly roll out, but also, really importantly, some practice application, all of which is drawn from direct practice, all of which is inspired by work with young people and children, including their illustrations, which I think really, hopefully, gets their voices included a little more. Thank you.
They were fantastic illustrations. Paul, can I just mention, I don't know how we're doing for time, but Garrett.
We're not doing very well, Tree. So
I know. Can I just mention Garrett? Garrett, I think, is here. Garrett Barman. He's written a very, very important chapter naming climate mania, with a client whose manic depressive experience was, related to discovering, really allowing himself to hear and understand what was happening. And I think it's Garrett says it's probably the first recorded case of climate mania. So it's a really, really important contribution. Thank you, Garrett.
Tree, you're down now to introduce the next section as well, which is bringing the eco-psychological tradition, which actually predates climate psychology. I think we've got Leslie Davenport, Kelvin Hall, and Chris Johnson.
Leslie's there. Yeah. Would you like to kick off, Leslie?
Sure. Thank you. This is so inspiring to hear all these contributions. In my chapter, I'm just going to mention two themes I try and bring to the foreground. One is about connecting more clearly what I think of as our internal landscapes with our external ones. Internal meaning thoughts, feelings, nervous system. There's so many things that we tend to sever and think of as separate and distinct from each other, but in fact, we're in constant communication. So how we perceive our environment, whether it's separate from us or recognizing the ways that we are inseparable from what we might call nature, is essential. And that in fact, working on the level of our perceptions of what are the lenses in front of our eyes when we behold other people and the more than human world and participate in our communities and cultures, and the ways that what's happening there has a direct effect on us. So that the healing is largely around reconnecting things that have become disconnected. And then related to that is expanding what we might think of as our internal world to beyond thoughts, feelings, and nervous system, and to really acknowledge the importance of, and it's been mentioned a little bit today, things like our creative wisdom, our ancestral wisdom, our collective wisdom, our somatic wisdom, and to be sure that these, which at least in our predominant Western culture have become somewhat dormant, and how to reactivate and connect them with all the things that have been talked about when we're looking at systems transformation.
Great, thank you very much, Leslie. And I think we want to call Kelvin and also Chris Johnson. Can we get them in our same room, Trang? I can't at the moment see them, but
I'm here.
You're there, Chris. Hi.
Yeah.
And there's Kelvin.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. So Kelvin, your chapter, how encounters with the other than human life can bring changes to the sense of self, is really what the essence is, the significance of entering the zone, as you call it. Do you want to tell us a little bit?
Okay. So, as you have said, central to my chapter is what I call the zone of encounter. And what I mean by that is a realm of experience or a state of mind in which human has an intimate, lucid, mutual conversation with other than human life of whatever form. In the chapter, of course, I try to explore a bit more what I mean by that. It's obviously non-verbal, but more in a way more communicative than it would be if it were verbal. What I illustrate is the ways that therapy can foster, can nurture, can bring out this area of experience, which in many people it can often be unconscious, that this can be part of the content of therapy, but it can also be part of the process of therapy. For instance, where the interventions of an animal are part of the session, and I explore some various aspects of this, particularly the way in which this can often be profoundly refreshing, revitalizing for the human, and can enable the human to feel that they are very much in present time, and that this is part of the way in which this kind of experience renews the human psyche, but it offers a model for renewing the relationship between human and other than human world.
Sorry, Kelvin, can I interrupt and just give over to Chris for a little bit, because I know we're running out of time, but thank you very much for that. Thank you. And Chris, would you like to share a little bit about the work that reconnects, which is your chapter?
Thank you. So I'm very interested in practices that help people hear themselves. And I thought we'd just try a 2-minute spiral. And before we look at something difficult, it's great to resource ourselves with gratitude. So I'm going to give a beginning sentence that just goes, for supporting me to live, I give thanks to. And if you had just 10 seconds, how would you finish that sentence? For supporting me to live, I give thanks to. Just taking a moment to resource ourselves before we look at what concerns us. So if there was another sentence, we're moving to honouring our pain. Aware of the climate crisis, feelings that come up include aware of the climate crisis. Feelings that come up include and when we face that and make room for that, we're aware of our call to action, call to adventure, but it also is named the issue of powerlessness. And so what begins then as the next part of the spiral is a journey to seek out perspectives that inspire and encourage us. So if you had a sentence that went something like, facing my concerns, what inspires me is. Facing my concerns, what inspires me is, and in 10 seconds, what comes? What inspires you? And then we move to the final part of the spiral, which is about finding our part to play. And if there was a sentence that went, something I feel called to do is, something I feel called to do is, what comes there if you had just 10 seconds to answer that? And of course, you can have more than 10 seconds, but not just now. And this is a framework that you can come back to, described in the chapter. And just on gratitude, I feel real gratitude of being here with you. And I'm going to express my gratitude by stopping.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I just do want to mention that Nick Totten, who wrote in this section on wild therapy, Nick isn't able to be here. But we've got his chapter joining the other excellent chapters in this section on the ecological. So moving on.
And just a thank you to Rosie Jones, who we worked together in the chapter. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you, Rosie. Who's here, I think, Rosie?
Okay, folks, we need to move on. We are well behind. Last section on community and social approaches. Judith, you're going to introduce this. You're muted.
Thank you. I'm going to introduce Chris. I'm just having to play slightly with the technology, so bear with me. And Helena, who was a co-writer of the book on social dreaming, and Julian. So forgive me while I can't see. Has Julian gone?
No, no, Julian's here.
Great, Julian, thank you. I just have to do his spot.
Joe is here, yeah.
Joe is here, that is great. So the theme of your chapters, and in a sense, we had a bit of a debate about whether Chris and Rosie's chapter should be in this section as well, because Joe's chapter actually includes research on Chris's methodology. And that's where I said right at the beginning, you know, the sections overlap. But what all your work has in common is stepping outside the consulting room, and none less than Chris's work on Through the Door, which is this wonderful metaphor of what we as therapists need to do, which is to both literally sometimes, as in the work that therapists, for example, are doing with asylum seekers, or the work of social dreaming, the work that reconnects, and so many other practices that are very important. And missing from here tonight is the work of climate cafes. And that's a very, very wonderful chapter. And it's a methodology that is helping an enormous number of people. So I wondered, Julian, because you're very much in the vanguard of working psychosocially, and I wonder if I can pin you down to kind of about 2 sentences on social dreaming and your chapter.
I'm just going to pass on to Chris.
Right. Okay.
Well, then I might pass back to Joe, because we've made a little threesome, and Joe's going to introduce it.
Great.
Yeah. So hello. So this was just a joint conversation that we had just between Chris and Julian and myself, so not including Helena, sorry. But we just wanted to start where we were. Might seem countercultural. I know we're running out of time tonight, but we thought we'd start with just a very short pause of 3 collective deep breaths together in silence before we go on. So that's just the invitation, just to notice anything that might have arisen with care and kindness first. So here's the first one. Also acknowledging the things that go beyond words. So as this section was about community and social approaches, and we knew we were at the end of this session, we thought we'd just offer a very condensed version of just the 3 chapters that we contributed to and wrote, and we put it together in a collective poem that Julian is going to start. So I'll pass to Julian.
Complexity. We are all alike, it or not like it. Occupy a movement once, a dream space apart, yet in part, like a fractal of the bigger picture, floating in the locked up lockdown of our shared minds and hearts, waiting for the water to rush in, both baptism and death by drowning, both condensed into possibility through dreaming, not drowning our sorrows.
Collaged fragments of the woods and the trees, the in-betweenness of waking and dream time, of co-creation, collective knowing, connection, crossing thresholds through the door, holding space to be with the unimaginable, the already here, loss, visceral porosity and creative unknowing, the courage of reanimating love within grief.
The troubles of this world lie heavy on my chest. There's so much suffering, I can't get no rest. Solastalgia, solastalgia, won't you leave me alone? Solastalgia, solastalgia, what's happened to our home? We took that condensed sunshine, the black gold. Now the earth is turning to a dream of old, a dream without egos and their dominant control, a dream so ancient it is yet to be told. Brother, I see the tears in your eye. Sister, I feel with you when you cry. My heart is bursting, it's more than concern. There is a way to learn, a way to repair, a way to die. As this is maybe the start of a communal poem, we invite you to contribute a few words in the chat that might we might be able to bring together at another time. And I'm also very aware, I might want to put you on the spot, Helena, of would you like to offer some sort of poetic, instantaneous response to what you've heard?
Hard to follow that, but just up on the grief that brings us to love. That's that's joining together, the connection, the relationship beyond ego that brings us to love, and that love is our practice going forward.
Judith, you're muted.
I'm without words because enough has been said, but we do need just to offer a brief space for questions.
Okay, thanks very much to you all on that last section of the book. We have about 10 minutes if we're going to go through to 9 o'clock. There is one question which has come up, which we might put to the panel of contributors. But if people have got a question that they'd like to speak to the group here, can you go to the reactions button and just raise your hand, and then we'll try and identify you. In the meanwhile, the question that is been asked, which I think is an interesting one in the chat channel: how do eco-emotions differ from the kinds of emotions provoked by world problems such as war? And given what's happening in Ukraine and Gaza at the moment, I think it's a very pertinent kind of question that's been asked. Do eco-emotions differ to these? Anybody?
Panu did answer that actually in the chat, Paul. I wonder if you could read his answer.
Did he?
That?
Oh yeah, here it is. Yeah, I haven't seen that one. It's just come up. Yeah, okay. While it is common that subjects in therapy touch the feelings of therapists themselves, take note of the unusual character of climate grief, which arises from the fact that we are all inside climate change. This is a difference between many macro worries, as they are sometimes called in research. Okay, so he identifies the issue of grief there. What do people think about that? As someone who's very concerned with issues going on in Gaza right now, I think grief is also a crucial aspect of the emotion I feel about Gaza as well, I'm afraid. Other thoughts, other people's contributions? Chris, were you going to say something?
Yes, I think part of the difficulty is that we don't, a lot of the population anyway, don't recognize that we are inside climate change. Exactly the point is we live in a culture that has isolated and separated us off from that.
Any thoughts that anybody wants to share with us from the floor, so to speak? If you have, raise your hand in the reactions section.
Chris Johnston.
A term Joanna Macy uses is pain for the world, which I find a very helpful umbrella. And I find helpful the distinction between me feelings and us feelings. So me feelings might be more about my personal life, and us feelings might be of any larger system that we belong to, including our family, our community, as well as the larger world. So I'd see them all under that umbrella of pain for the world.
Pain for the world. Good one. Has anyone raised their hand?
Yeah, Iona.
Iona?
And Rosie. Iona and then Rosie.
It's the sort of question that you could debate for hours and hours, isn't it? But if I think about how it is in my focus, it's that there's a continuum. There's a continuum because we're in a collective field, and the collective field includes conflict, and it includes all the emotions and the feelings to do with conflict, and it includes all the dynamics of power, and those dynamics of power are intrinsic to what's happening in the world. So in the face of all of that, how I navigate my contribution is not actually significantly different in relation to Gaza than it is in relation to climate grief and climate rage. They are all processes that I take into my inner world and my inner reality, not as a separating from outer world, but I take them in and I work on that process, and I find something that's creative that addresses all of that.
Thank you, Ina. Thank you. Rosie, you've got your hand up there.
Hi. Yeah, for me, what comes up with that question is the difference. And again, I think Joanna Macy has spoken to this for many decades. The difference between, and this isn't to belittle them at all, but issues which are in some sense transient, even if we're talking decades or centuries, and with climate change, the actual existential threat to everything. The fact that, I mean, Joanna talked about it initially around the nuclear threat, and that was a sort of step function change in, and you know, humans prior to then had never had to face the idea that the continued existence of humanity or even the ecosystem itself could end, and that there's a very different sort of psychological, it's a step into some other thing for which we are attempting to wrap our heads around. So that comes up very strongly for me, is around this.
Right. Thank you, Rosie. Folks, we're going to have to finish at this point. I'd just like to take a moment to thank once more Judith, Tree, Jenny, and Caroline for putting this cornucopia of ideas together in this book. And we're really looking forward to seeing it coming out into the wider world, where I'm sure it's going to have a real impact, not just in the world of therapeutic practice, but beyond that itself. I know a lot of people have had to leave us already, but I thank all of you who've been here this evening to witness this launch, and long may we all continue with the work that we are so passionate about. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Yay.